The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October of 1883, and Delia Winslow read it 3 times before she allowed herself to believe what it said. Foreclosure. The word sat at the bottom of the page like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples of it moved through her chest in slow, terrible waves. She was standing in the doorway of the farmhouse her father had built with his own 2 hands, the one he had died in, the one where her mother had breathed her last the following winter, and the one where her husband, Thomas Winslow, had gone cold and gray on the kitchen floor 2 springs past, clutching at his left arm and then at nothing at all. The bank out of Abilene was giving her 45 days. The loan her husband had taken against the property, the one she had not known about until after they buried him, had come due. And she had nothing. 45 days, and she had nothing left to give. She folded the letter along its crease and slid it into the pocket of her work apron, because there were still chickens to feed, and a cow to milk, and a fence post along the north pasture that had been listing at a dangerous angle for the better part of 2 weeks. The land did not care about foreclosure notices. The land had never cared about anything she needed it to care about. She stepped off the porch into the hard-packed dirt of the yard and stood very still for a moment, looking out across the flat Kansas plain in every direction. The sky was enormous and pale and indifferent. The grass had gone yellow and brittle in the October cold. Somewhere out on the far edge of the property, a coyote was crying at nothing. 45 days. She had come to this land with her family when she was 9 years old, in the spring of 1861, following her father's dream of a homestead of their own, a piece of earth that would grow into something lasting. They had come out of Tennessee with a wagon and 3 mules and more hope than sense, and they had driven their stakes into the ground 40 miles southeast of Abilene and called it theirs. The first summer had been hard. The second had been harder. Then there was the drought of 1864 that burned the corn down to nothing before July. Then the grasshoppers came in 1874, and they were not a single swarm but a living ocean of them, a black sky of grinding teeth that had descended on every homestead in the county and left the earth looking like something stripped down to bone. Delia had been 22 that year, newly married to Thomas, who was a decent man with steady hands and a good heart, though he was not a man built for catastrophe. The grasshoppers had eaten the crops, the wooden handles of the tools, the leather of the harnesses, the curtains in the front window. They had eaten everything. The land had always taken. Season after season it had taken. But she had stayed, because there was nowhere else to go and no money to get there with, and because the land was hers even when it did not behave like it. She had stayed through the droughts and the grasshoppers and Thomas's death and the winters that went on past endurance, and now she stood in the cold October morning with 45 days and almost nothing in her account at the bank, and she tried to think of what there was left to do. It was Mabel Prout from 3 miles down the road who first mentioned the name Phineas Wells. Delia had ridden into town the following Saturday, which was the 1st of November, to speak to Mr. Aldridge at the Farmers and Merchants Bank about her situation. Mr. Aldridge was a pale, soft-handed man who smelled of hair pomade and spoke with the careful, rehearsed sympathy of someone who had delivered bad news enough times that it no longer touched him personally. He had explained to her, with documents spread across his wide oak desk, that the loan Thomas had taken was secured against the property itself, that the amount owed was $430, and that without payment in full by the 15th of December, the bank would move to seize the property. He had suggested she might find someone to purchase the land outright before the deadline, so she might at least walk away with whatever remained above the debt. She had thanked him in a voice she barely recognized and walked out into the gray November street. Mabel Prout caught her arm near the general store. Mabel was a round-faced woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a willingness to share everything she noticed. "You look like a woman who just had the floor pulled out from under her," Mabel said. "That is about the size of it," Delia said. Mabel pulled her sideways into the narrow gap between the general store and the hardware shop, out of the wind, and lowered her voice as though she were sharing a secret of great strategic importance. "There is a man," she said, "out of Texas originally, been here in Barton County about 3 years now. He bought the old Hatcher spread east of town and has been building it into something serious. Runs cattle, has some hired men, does things properly. His name is Phineas Wells." "I know who he is," Delia said, "because everyone in the county knew who Phineas Wells was, in the way that you know a large weather system is moving through the area without having been directly in its path. He was talked about. He was respected. He was, according to most accounts, fair but not soft, which in Delia's experience was the best you could say of any man who had made himself something in this country. He has been looking," Mabel said carefully, "to expand his operation. Not aggressively, not like those big cattle syndicates that swallow up land for sport, but seriously. He has been known to pay fair prices for properties when the situation is right." Delia felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the November wind. "You are suggesting I sell to him?" "I am suggesting," Mabel said, "that if you are going to lose the land to someone, you might prefer it be someone who will pay you fair over a bank that will pay you nothing. At the very least, a conversation costs you nothing." Delia had ridden home that evening in a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of weather. The idea of selling her father's land, her husband's land, the land she had poured 30 years of her life into, sat in her stomach like something she could not digest. But the arithmetic was the arithmetic, and $430 was $430, and she had $63 in the bank and a property that was worth, by Mr. Aldridge's own estimation, somewhere between $500 and $600 if sold quickly and under current conditions. She thought about it for 3 days, and on the 4th day she put on her best dress, which was a dark blue wool she had made herself in the winter of 1879, and which she had altered twice since as her body changed with the years, and she drove her wagon east to the Wells property. The entrance to his land was marked by a gate made of good timber, properly set, with the name Wells burned into the crossbeam in letters that were careful rather than showy. The road past the gate was better maintained than most of the public roads in the county. She followed it for nearly a mile before the house came into view, and it stopped her breath for a moment, not because it was grand, but because it was solid in a way that suggested it had been built to last generations. It was a 2-story stone and timber house, low and wide, with a covered porch running its full front length. There were outbuildings in good repair, a large barn, corrals with cattle standing easy, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse. There was a kitchen garden that had been put to bed properly for winter, the rows turned and covered with straw. There was order here, but not the rigid, joyless order of a man who was afraid of things getting away from him. It was the order of someone who cared. A man came out of the barn as she pulled her wagon to a stop in the yard. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, with the kind of physical presence that you noticed before you noticed the details, not because he was imposing exactly, but because he moved with a settled certainty that took up space in a room or a yard without any apparent effort. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair going just slightly gray at the temples, and a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something honest and angular. His eyes, when he looked up at her from under the brim of his hat, were a clear and serious gray. "Mrs. Winslow," he said, which surprised her because she had not announced herself. "You know me," she said. "I know most of the people in the county," he said, without any particular weight attached to it. "What brings you out this way?" She had practiced what she intended to say during the ride, a composed and businesslike presentation of her situation, but sitting there in the wagon looking at him in the clear November light, she found herself saying something different. "I am about to lose my land," she said, "and Mabel Prout thinks you might be in a position to prevent that from happening in a way that is fair to both of us." I think she may be optimistic about your generosity, but I have run out of things to lose by asking." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She could not have borne pity. Something more like recognition. "Step down," he said. "We will talk." The inside of his house was as orderly as the outside, with the additional quality of being genuinely lived in. There were books on the shelves in the main room, real books, not just almanacs and hymnals, but novels and histories, and what looked like several volumes of law. There was a fireplace burning low and warm. The furniture was plain but well made. There was no woman's touch to the room, but it was not neglected, and she had the sense that whatever Phineas Wells did, he did it fully, including keeping his own house. He brought her coffee without asking and sat across the table from her and listened without interrupting while she explained her situation. The loan, the amount, the deadline, the $63 she had, the property value. She told it all because she had decided on the ride over that she would tell it plainly and not perform distress she already felt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands twice. "What are you asking me for exactly?" he said. "A purchase." "Yes," she said. "A fair purchase, enough above the loan amount that I walk away with something, and enough that I am not simply handing myself to the bank." He nodded slowly. "Your property borders my north pasture. I know. How much land? 320 acres, the house and outbuildings, a well that has never gone dry even in the droughts." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I would offer you $550 for the land, the house, and all the outbuildings. That leaves you $120 after the debt is settled, and it is a fair price for the market right now, not a charity price." She had told herself she would not feel anything about this. She had built a wall around the feeling all the way out here in the wagon, but when he said it, the finality of it, a price on the thing that had defined her entire life, the wall developed a crack that she had to work hard to keep from becoming visible. "That is a fair price," she said carefully. "I accept." "There is a condition," he said. She looked at him directly. "What condition?" "I am not buying you out of desperation so I can watch you leave this county with $120 and no place to go," he said. His voice was even but very direct. "I need a good person on that property to manage the house, oversee the kitchen garden, and handle the domestic organization of a working cattle spread that is getting bigger than one man and a bunkhouse full of cowhands can properly manage. The position comes with the house to live in, your wages, and the right to work the small garden plot for your own use. It is a proper working arrangement, not charity." She stared at him. "You are offering to buy my home," she said slowly, "and then hire me to live in it." "I am offering to buy the property and employ the best qualified person I know of to manage it," he said. "It is a business arrangement that happens to be convenient for both parties." She thought about this for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the bare branches of the cottonwood trees along his fence line. "Why would you do that?" she said. "You could buy the property and put one of your own hired men in the house." He met her eyes steadily. "Because you know that land better than anyone alive. Because you have worked it for over 20 years and kept it going through conditions that would have broken most men. Because I believe in putting the right person in the right position when the opportunity presents itself." He paused. "And because I am not in the habit of profiting from other people's misfortune without doing something useful with what I gain." She could feel the crack in the wall getting wider, and she pressed her hand flat against the table to steady herself. "This is a strange arrangement, Mr. Wells." "It is a practical one," he said. "Take a day to think about it if you need to." She did not need a day. She knew that already. She had 45 days and $63, and the offer in front of her was the best thing the land had offered her in longer than she could remember. "I do not need a day," she said. "I accept." He extended his hand across the table and she shook it, and his grip was firm and honest, and she thought that she had perhaps shaken 100 hands in her life, and none of them had felt quite like this one. She moved to the property, her own property that now belonged to him, On the 20th of November, 1883, with her personal things in the wagon and the deed transferred and the bank debt paid, and $120 in an envelope in her coat pocket. She stood in the yard of the place she had lived for 22 years and looked at the house and the barn and the empty winter fields, and she said goodbye to it in a way that she had not done when it was still technically hers, because grief requires a kind of finality to be real. Then she went inside and started a fire in the kitchen stove, and began making the inventory that Phineas Wells had asked for of all the domestic and storage resources on the property. She had been at it for 2 hours when she heard a horse in the yard and then boots on the porch and then a knock at the door, which surprised her because it was, she had to remind herself, his door. "Come in," she called. He came in with his hat in his hand and a paper folder under his arm. He looked around the kitchen, at the fire she had started and the inventory she had begun, and something in his expression shifted in a way she could not entirely read. "I thought I would come by to go over the arrangement properly," he said. "Wages, responsibilities, the plan for the spring." "Sit down, then," she said. And she said it as naturally as she would have to anyone in her own kitchen, and then caught herself, and he caught her catching herself, and the ghost of something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. "This is still your kitchen," he said quietly. "I bought the land, not the way you run things in here." She poured him coffee without asking and sat across from him, and they went over the arrangement. Her wages were $12 a month, which was more than she had expected. Her responsibilities included the management of the kitchen garden in season, the preservation and storage of food for the household and the bunkhouse crew, the management of the house itself, and the coordination of domestic supplies. She would have one hired girl from town 2 days a week to help with the heavier work. It was a proper working arrangement. It was practical and businesslike and entirely sensible. She told herself that for the better part of 2 weeks before she admitted to herself, in the privacy of her own thoughts in the small hours of the morning, that Phineas Wells was a man she could not stop thinking about. It was not a simple thing. She was 31 years old and had been widowed for nearly 2 years, and she was not a woman given to romantic thinking. She had been fond of Thomas, genuinely fond of him, and his death had left a wound that was real even if their marriage had been more partnership than passion. What she felt when she was near Phineas Wells was something different and unsettling, and she was not entirely sure she trusted it. She noticed things about him that she had no particular business noticing. The way he spoke to his hired men, with a directness that was also respectful. The way he made decisions, quickly but not carelessly, with the quality of someone who had thought through the options before he sat down to think about them. The way he appeared sometimes at the property to go over things with her, always with a reason, always with a purpose, and always with a manner that was correct and measured, but that somehow, around the edges of it, contained something warmer. He began coming by more often than the arrangement strictly required. He would ride over in the late afternoon to discuss the spring planting plans, or to consult about the supply order for the bunkhouse kitchen, or to look at the fence along the north pasture that he was planning to extend. These were all real reasons. None of them were invented. But there were always a few minutes at the beginning or the end of these visits that were not about cattle or fencing or supply orders, a few minutes where they simply talked, and she found that she looked forward to those few minutes with an intensity that she found both pleasurable and alarming. In December, the first real blizzard of the season came down from the north on a Thursday night. Delia had spent the afternoon putting extra wood in, checking the animals, preparing what she could, and she had just come inside from the last round of outdoor work when the storm hit with a ferocity that shook the house on its foundation. The wind came from the northwest with a howl that sounded personal, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and the snow was horizontal, and then it was everything. She sat by the fire that night alone and listened to the storm, and found herself thinking about the summers when she was 9 and 10 and 11, learning the land with her father, learning its moods and seasons, learning to read the sky and the grass and the behavior of the animals for signs of what was coming. Her father had been a man of great patience and great love for the earth he had claimed. She had inherited both of those things, and some of the love had survived even after the earth had taken so much from her. The storm lasted 3 days. On the second day, in the early afternoon, she heard a knock at the door and opened it to find Phineas Wells standing on the porch, covered in snow from hat to boot, with a sack of flour and 2 blankets over his shoulder, and an expression of studied casualness that did not entirely match the effort it had clearly cost him to get there. "I came to check on the property," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Outside, the storm was howling with a wind that could strip bark from a tree. "You rode 3 miles in a blizzard," she said, "to check on the property." He met her eyes. "And on you," he said, with a simplicity that hit her somewhere square in the chest. She stepped back and let him in, and he shook the snow off himself on the porch and came inside, and the fire was going strong and she had soup on the stove, and he looked around the kitchen with an expression that she could only call relief. "Sit," she said. "You will have to wait the storm out before you go back." "I brought flour," he said, "in case you were running low." "I was running low," she said, which was not quite true, but she did not see any reason to take the gift away from him. He sat at the kitchen table, and she served him soup, and she sat across from him. And the storm screamed outside, and the fire burned warm inside, and they talked for 4 hours. And it was the kind of talking that happens when 2 people are alone together in the middle of weather that makes the rest of the world feel very far away. They talked about where they had come from. She from Tennessee by way of 30 years of Kansas. He from Texas by way of a father who had driven cattle up the Kishom Trail, and a mother who had died young, and a decision at the age of 22 to make something permanent and rooted rather than continuing his family's migratory way of life. They talked about the land, about what it asked of people and what it gave back, and whether the equation ever came out even. "Do you think it does?" she asked him. "Come out even?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted and settled. "I think the land does not calculate," he said. "It does not keep accounts. It does what it does, and if you are in its path, you bear what it brings. What comes out even or better is what you build with the people around you, not what the land decides to give." She looked at him across the table and thought that this was perhaps the most important thing she had heard anyone say in several years. He stayed the night, because the storm had not abated, and the temperature outside was the kind of cold that could kill a man on horseback. He slept in the front room on the settee with his coat over him, and she lay in her room listening to the storm and thinking about the fact that Phineas Wells was sleeping 20 feet away, and about what that meant, and about the fact that she was 31 years old, and she had not felt this alive in a very long time. By morning, the storm had eased enough for him to ride. He ate breakfast with her, eggs and bread and the strong black coffee she made, and when he left he stood at the door for a moment. In that way he had some times of seeming about to say something that he then did not say. She waited. "Mrs. Winslow," he said. "Delia," she said. She had not planned to say it. "You may call me Delia." Something settled in his expression, something that had been held slightly in suspension. "Delia," he said, "thank you for the hospitality." "Thank you for the flour," she said. He smiled then, fully and without reservation, and it changed his face in a way that did something entirely unreasonable to her composure. "Phineas," he said. She met his eyes. "I know," she said. He put his hat on and went out into the cold white morning, and she watched him ride north from the window until the flat gray landscape swallowed him. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, and then she turned back to the kitchen and the day's work, and she noticed that the room felt different with him gone than it had felt before he came. January of 1884 was long and cold and deeply quiet. The work on a farm in winter is the work of maintenance and preparation, of keeping things alive until the season turns, and Delia was good at it. She had always been good at the waiting work, the patient repetitive labor of tending and preserving. She inventoried supplies, mended and replaced, corresponded with seed merchants for the spring, planned the kitchen garden on paper with a precision that she found genuinely satisfying. She wrote detailed reports for Phineas on the state of the property's resources and what she estimated they would need for the season ahead. He came by twice a week through January, usually in the afternoon. Sometimes these visits had a specific purpose, a question about a supply order or a decision to be made about the spring planting. Sometimes they began with a specific purpose and then extended well past it into the kind of conversation that had been building between them since the blizzard, a conversation that felt less like talk and more like the slow, careful construction of something. She was not a woman who deceived herself about her own feelings. She knew what was growing in her. She also knew the complications of it, the fact that she worked for him, that the arrangement gave him a power over her circumstances that she had not had the luxury of avoiding, and that she had spent enough of her life without autonomy that she was not willing to simply give what remained of it away without being very sure. And so she watched him carefully, the way she had learned to watch the sky and the land, reading for the true thing underneath the surface thing. What she saw was this: he was a man without hidden motives. His dark past, such as it was not darkness in the sinister sense but in the human one. He had made mistakes and corrected them. He had been hurt and he had not let the hurt make him small. He treated people, his hired men, the townspeople, the merchants he dealt with a consistency of respect that told her something essential about his character. He did not have one face for people he needed and another for people he did not. He was the same man in all directions. She also saw this. He was falling in love with her, in the careful way of someone who was paying attention to the fact that she was not a woman to be pushed or rushed, who understood that the ground she stood on had been unstable for a very long time, and who was proceeding with the deliberateness of someone building something he intended to last. On the 15th of February, he arrived in the afternoon with a package wrapped in brown paper, which he set on the kitchen table with an expression of such studied nonchalance that she nearly smiled. "What is this?" she said. "A practical item," he said. She unwrapped it. It was a book, a thick one with a deep green cover. It was a collection of poems, Longfellow and Whitman and several others, the kind of thing a person read for the sheer pleasure of language rather than for any practical purpose. She looked up at him. "That is not a practical item," she said. "I thought you might enjoy it," he said. "You have an orderly mind. Orderly minds sometimes need something that does not organize." She held the book for a moment. She had not owned a book of poetry since she was a girl in Tennessee, when her mother had kept a small collection on the shelf in the parlor of the house they had left behind. The memory of it sat in her chest like something both sweet and painful. "Thank you," she said, and the simplicity of the words did not contain everything she meant. "I also came to ask you something," he said. She set the book carefully on the table and looked at him. He was standing near the window, and the February light came in at an angle that caught the planes of his face and the gray in his dark hair, and she thought that she had never seen anyone who looked more completely like themselves. "I have been thinking about this arrangement," he said. "The arrangement we have. And I want to be honest with you about something." Her heart did a complicated thing. "All right," she said. "I set it up the way I did," he said, "partly for the reasons I gave you, which were true, but also because I did not want you to leave. I thought the practical version of the thing was the only one you would accept, and I may have been right about that. But I did not want there to be a hidden motive between us because I do not believe in that. Whatever comes next, I want you to know the whole of why I did what I did." She was very still. "You set up the arrangement," she said carefully, "because you wanted me to stay." "Yes. And now you are telling me this because you want something different." He met her eyes directly. "I am telling you this because you deserve to know it, and because whatever you decide from here, I want it to be made with full knowledge. Not because I am trying to force a choice. Not because I think you owe me anything, but because I think you are a woman who makes better decisions with the truth than without it." She stood very still for a long moment, and the February wind moved through the eaves of the house with a sound like breathing. "You are a very unusual man, Phineas Wells," she said. "I have been told that," he said. "Not always as a compliment, I imagine." "Not always," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "I am going to need a little time." "Take all the time you need," he said. And he said it in a way that made her believe absolutely that he meant it. He left. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the book of poems in her hands, and outside the February sky turned orange and then purple, and then the hard dark of a clear winter night, and the stars came out one by one over the flat Kansas plain. She gave herself exactly 1 week. She thought carefully about the sequence of things, about who he was and what he had done, and what her life looked like from the outside and the inside. She thought about Thomas, who had been a good man she had been fond of, and about the loan she had not known about, and about the way one season after another had taken what she had. She thought about whether what she felt for Phineas Wells was something built on the unstable ground of need and gratitude or something else, something she could trust. She concluded, after 7 days of honest and rigorous examination, that it was something else. On the 22nd of February, she rode north to his house on his property on a clear, cold morning, with the sky as blue and clean as anything she had ever seen. She tied her horse at the post and knocked at his door. He opened it and saw her face, and something in his own face went very quiet and attentive. "I am done taking time," she said. He stood there in the doorway in his work clothes with the morning light behind her and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "What conclusion did you reach?" She looked at him levelly. "That I am 31 years old and I have spent a significant portion of my life enduring things because there was no other option. That when something good appears, the right response is not to be suspicious of it indefinitely. That you are an honest man and I trust you, and I have not trusted anyone the way I trust you since my father." She paused. "And that I have been in love with you for approximately 2 months, and I am tired of conducting myself as though I am not." He was absolutely still for 1 second, and then he came off the porch and put his hands on her face, very carefully, and kissed her in the clear, cold February morning with the blue sky enormous above them, and the wind coming across the prairie, with the first faint smell of something that was not quite winter anymore. It was a long kiss and a careful one, and when it ended she felt him rest his forehead against hers and heard him breathe out slowly, like a man releasing something he had been holding for too long. "Delia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been in love with you since November," he said. "I know," she said. "I was watching." He laughed then, a full and unguarded laugh that she had not heard from him before, and it was the best sound she had heard in years. Spring came to the Kansas plain in the first week of April, 1884, with a warmth that felt like forgiveness. Delia turned the kitchen garden with a thoroughness born of 20 years of practice, working the soil with a pleasure she had not felt in a long time because, for the first time in a long time, she was working it without the shadow of impending loss hanging over every furrow. The land was the same land it had always been, the same hard-natured, demanding, indifferent plain, but her relationship to it had changed in some fundamental way. It had taken from her for so long that she had come to expect taking as the baseline. Now there was something solid behind her that made the land's taking feel survivable in a different way, because she was no longer alone against it. She and Phineas were not secretive about their courtship, because neither of them was a person who did things they needed to hide. They were seen together in town on several occasions, walking or at the general store or at Sunday services at the small Methodist church on the west side of town, and the county had its opinions, as the county always did. There were those who thought it was fast. There were those who thought it was unseemly, the widow woman working for the Cattleman and then not just working. Mabel Prout, for her part, moved through these conversations with an expression of profound self-satisfaction, having been the architect of the original introduction. Delia cared about the opinions of the county approximately as much as she had ever cared about them, which was to the extent that they had real consequences and no further. Phineas asked her to marry him on a Tuesday evening in May, sitting on the porch of what had been her farmhouse, watching the sun go down over the wheat fields that were just beginning to green up. He did not make a speech about it. He said simply, "I would like for us to be married, Delia. Not because of the arrangement or the property or any practical consideration, but because you are the person I want to spend my life with, and I would like to do that openly and properly." She had been half expecting it and fully prepared for it, and it still undid her slightly, the plain directness of it, the absence of performance in a moment that many men would have made theatrical. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He took her hand and held it, and they sat on the porch in the warm May evening and watched the last of the day go golden over the Kansas plain. They were married on the 14th of June, 1884, in the Methodist church in town, in a ceremony that was simple and brief, and attended by more people than either of them had invited, because the county was interested. Mabel Prout cried, which she would afterward vehemently deny. Delia wore a dress of pale gray silk she had ordered from the dry goods catalog, and had worked on for 3 weeks to make fit properly, and she wore her mother's small pearl earrings, which had traveled from Tennessee to Kansas in a velvet pouch in the bottom of a trunk, and had somehow survived everything. Phineas wore his good suit, and a look of such complete contentment that she thought it was perhaps the most unguarded she had ever seen him. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Clay, who was a man of few words and precise ones, and when it was done and Phineas kissed her in front of the assembled county, she felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled since she was a girl, something that was the absence of bracing for the next thing to go wrong. They rode back to the property together in the late afternoon of their wedding day, and the wheat fields were full and golden in the June light, and the sky above the Kansas plain was as large and luminous as anything in the world, and Delia Winslow, who was now Delia Wells, thought that this might be what it felt like when the equation finally came out even. It was better than even. She knew that now. The summer of 1884 was the best summer the land had given her in her memory. The winter had brought good moisture, the spring had been mild, and the rains came at the right times through June and into July. The kitchen garden grew with a productivity that she found almost personally satisfying, as though it were cooperating with her changed circumstances out of some sympathetic response. The wheat in the fields that had been hers and were now Phineas's, and therefore hers again in the larger sense, came up full and golden, and the cattle on the north pasture were fat and healthy. She learned the scale of Phineas's operation from the inside, which was more complex than she had realized from the outside. He ran a cattle operation that was substantial, but not yet large by the standards of the big Texas syndicates, which were beginning to move through the region with the kind of appetite that worried small operators everywhere. He had 37 head of breeding stock, 2 full-time hired men in addition to the seasonal hands, contracts with a buyer out of Kansas City, and plans to expand carefully in both cattle and a winter wheat program over the next several years. He was methodical about it, not visionary in a reckless way but patient and precise, building towards something rather than reaching for it. She became his partner in this in a way that went beyond what their original arrangement had specified. She was good with numbers and with planning, and she had the kind of knowledge about the specific land they were working that no amount of general experience could substitute for. She knew where the soil went shallow on the east side of the north pasture and would not support winter wheat without amendment. She knew the spring on the back 40 that went reliable in late April and could be improved to water the additional stock he was planning. She knew things that were in her bones from 20 years of paying attention, and she gave all of it freely, because it was his land and hers, and the difference was no longer one that mattered to her. In September she discovered she was pregnant. She sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she told him, not from any uncertainty about how he would receive it, but from a private need to hold it alone for a moment before it became shared, to let it settle into herself first. She had not expected this. She and Thomas had been married for 9 years and there had been no children, and she had made her peace with that long ago, told herself it was not meant to be, accepted it as one more thing the land had taken. She told Phineas on a Sunday morning in the kitchen, over breakfast. He set his coffee cup down very slowly. He looked at her across the table and the expression on his face moved through several things: surprise, wonder, something almost vulnerable, and then settled on a joy so complete it was almost difficult to look at directly. "Are you certain?" he said. "Quite," she said. He came around the table and pulled her carefully to her feet and held her with a tenderness that was different from any way he had held her before, and she felt him press his lips to the top of her head and heard him say, very quietly, "Thank you." She laughed a little, her face against his chest. "I do not think I get the exclusive credit for this." "You know what I mean," he said. She did. The pregnancy was not easy. She was 32. Which was not dangerously old, but was old enough that Dr. Marsh in town counseled caution. The autumn was tiring in a way she had not anticipated, and there were weeks in November and December where the nausea was relentless, and the fatigue was a physical weight she carried through every hour. Phineas managed this with a practical attentiveness that she found deeply moving. He did not hover or fuss, because she would not have tolerated either, but he was present and useful, and he took over things she had always handled without being asked, and without making it feel like a diminishment. He hired a second hired girl to help with the domestic work through the winter. He rode to town himself to fetch the supplies she needed rather than having one of the hands do it. He sat with her in the evenings and read aloud to her from the books on his shelves when she was too tired to read herself, and she lay on the settee with her eyes closed, and listened to his voice, reading history and fiction and poetry into the warm fire-lit room. And she thought that this was a life she could not have imagined 18 months ago, when she was standing in the doorway of her dying farm with a foreclosure notice in her apron pocket. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was the mildest in several years, which she took as a personal kindness from a sky that owed her several. Her son was born on the 23rd of March, 1885, after a labor of 17 hours that Dr. Marsh attended, with Mabel Prout present at Delia's own request, because Mabel had been present at more births than the doctor, and Delia trusted her practical knowledge. He arrived in the early morning, a large and vigorous infant with dark hair and a set of lungs that announced his arrival to the whole sleeping house. Phineas, who had been in the front room through the entire 17 hours in the kind of barely controlled tension she had never seen from him before, came in when it was over and stood at the bedside looking down at the child in her arms with an expression of complete disorientation that she found endearing beyond measure. "He is very small," Phineas said. "He is actually quite large for a newborn," said Dr. Marsh. "He looks fragile," Phineas said. "He is perfectly healthy," said Dr. Marsh. "You can hold him," Delia said. Phineas held his son for the first time with the extreme caution of a man holding something that he could not afford to drop and did not know the proper procedure for, and the child, apparently unbothered by his father's uncertainty, promptly went asleep in his arms. They named him James, after Delia's father, with the middle name Henry after Phineas's father, which felt like the right joining of two histories into one. Spring of 1885 was busy in the way that all springs on a working farm were busy, and busier than usual because it was their first spring as a family of 3, and because Phineas was expanding the cattle operation, and there was new fencing to put up and additional stock to manage. Delia came back to full capacity faster than Dr. Marsh had advised, because she was not constitutionally suited to half capacity, and because there was too much to do. Phineas expressed his concerns about this once, clearly and directly, and she expressed her own understanding of her body and its limitations, also clearly and directly, and they came to an agreement that she would be the judge of what she was capable of, and he would stop worrying quite so visibly. He only half kept his end of the bargain, but she found she did not mind as much as she had expected. James was a good baby, and then a good infant, growing with an enthusiasm that his grandparents' spirits would have taken pleasure in if any of them had been alive to see it. He had Delia's eyes, the particular shade of green-gray that was the color of Kansas sky before a storm, and Phineas's tendency toward silence in the face of things he was concentrating on, which expressed itself in a toddler as a disconcerting habit of staring at objects for long periods before he did anything with them. The summer of 1885 brought a dry spell in July that made Delia's chest tighten with the old reflex of fear, but the rains came back in August, and the wheat held, and the cattle stayed fat, and the season ended well. That fall, there was a development in the county that Phineas came home from town to tell her about with an expression she did not like. A land syndicate out of England, one of the British cattle companies that had been buying up large sections of the Plain States, had acquired the Hennessy property to the south, which was 3,000 acres, and was reportedly looking to expand further. There were rumors that they had approached several other landowners in the area with offers that were technically fair, but had the quality of offers made by someone who did not intend to accept no. "They cannot force us to sell," she said. "No," he agreed. "But they can make it uncomfortable. They have the resources to fence their water sources and create access problems for smaller operators. It is a common tactic." He looked at the map he had spread on the kitchen table, their land in the center of it, the Hennessy property marked to the south. "I want us to be clear-eyed about this." "What are you thinking?" she said. "I am thinking that if we formalize our water agreements with the neighboring properties to our north and east, we become significantly harder to isolate. I am also thinking that we should look at increasing our cattle numbers this spring so that our operation is substantive enough to be an inconvenient target rather than an easy one." She looked at the map. "The Callaway place to the east has been struggling. Their well situation is poor." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about whether there is a way to help them that is also practical for us." She looked at him. "You want to extend our water access to the Callaways." "I want to discuss it with them," he said, "in a way that is a genuine offer of cooperation rather than a charity they would not accept." She thought about Mabel Prout 3 years ago in the narrow gap between the general store and the hardware shop. She thought about the way an offer made in the right spirit could change the entire shape of a situation. "I will come with you," she said. They went to the Callaway place together the following Saturday, she and Phineas and James, who was 7 months old and apparently very interested in the whole enterprise. The Callaways, William and his wife Ruth, were a couple in their late 30s who had been on their land for 12 years and were solid, careful people in the way of those who had survived the plains by being fundamentally realistic. The conversation about water sharing and mutual land access was careful and took most of an afternoon, with coffee and Ruth's excellent dried apple pie and James being passed around and admired. And by the end of it, there was an agreement in principle that was formalized in writing the following week. The British syndicate, when it came to their area more directly in early 1886, found a set of neighboring operations that were more connected than they had anticipated, with water agreements and access arrangements that made the kind of isolation tactics they typically employed significantly more complicated. They made one offer to Phineas that was, as he had predicted, technically fair but with an undertone of pressure. He declined it with a politeness that contained no apology. They did not make a second offer. She watched him handle this and felt a pride in him that was also a kind of relief, the relief of being protected in a way that did not require her to be smaller to receive it. Life on the Wells property settled into rhythms that were demanding and full and genuinely good. There were difficult seasons. The drought of 1886 was real, not as catastrophic as 1864 had been, but serious enough that they lost some of the wheat, and had to move cattle earlier than planned. They managed it together, making the hard decisions about which fields to let go and which to fight for, about how to allocate the water from the well that had never gone dry, about what to sell and what to keep. These were not small decisions, and they did not always agree immediately, but they had built between them the kind of trust that made disagreement productive rather than destructive. They argued clearly and listened to each other, and reached conclusions that were usually better than either starting position. After the drought of 1886, Phineas began work on a more extensive water management system for the property, a series of berms and channels, and a storage pond that would capture rainwater and reduce their dependence on a single wet season. This was not a new idea, but he pursued it with the patient exactness she had come to know in him, consulting with men who had done similar work in other parts of the region, reading what he could find on the subject, spending an entire winter planning it before breaking ground the following spring. She was pregnant with their second child during the construction of the water system, which meant that she watched most of it from a supervisory position she did not entirely choose, but which she used productively, taking detailed notes on the project that Phineas said were more useful than anything he could have written himself. Their second child was also a boy, born in July of 1887, a summer baby with a sweaty and vociferous arrival that was somewhat faster than James's had been. They named him William, for no ancestor in particular, but because it was a good name and it suited him. William arrived in the world with a decisiveness that he kept. Where James was contemplative and thorough, William from his earliest months was interested in action and direct engagement with things, and between the two of them, they provided a comprehensive range of small-child chaos that kept the household in a state of organized energy that Delia found, to her own surprise, almost entirely enjoyable. Phineas was a father with the same quality he brought to everything, consistent and engaged and careful, with a dry humor about the whole enterprise that she appreciated enormously. He was not sentimental in the performed way, but he was present in the real way, which was better. He taught James to walk the fence lines with him by the time the boy was 3, explaining the property in the patient and detailed way that Delia recognized from his conversations with her, as though James's understanding of the land was something he intended to build properly. She watched this sometimes from the kitchen window, the tall man and the small boy walking the perimeter of their fields, and felt something in her chest that was not quite like any other feeling she had. The water system that Phineas built was, in the drought years of 1889 and 1890, the thing that saved them when neighboring farms were burning up and selling out. The storage pond held enough water through the dry summers to keep the kitchen garden and the most critical fields alive, and the channel system moved what rain did come into places it could be used rather than lost. People came to look at it from other farms in the county, and Phineas showed them everything, explained every decision and every calculation, offered no advantage to himself in what he shared. Word of what he had done spread, and there was a period in the late fall of 1889 when men came almost weekly to walk the system and take notes, and he spent a great deal of time talking about water and soil, and the long dry future that everyone with sense could see coming for the plains. She sat with him one evening in October of 1889, after the last of that season's visitors had gone, and said, "You could charge for this." "For what?" "The knowledge, the plans, the time you spend explaining." He looked genuinely puzzled. "They need it." "Yes," she said, "that is why people typically charge." He thought about it for a moment. "It is more valuable to me as goodwill than as income," he said. "We know what we have here. We do not need the county to be struggling for us to be doing well. It works better if they are doing well too." She looked at him. There it was, that thing she had identified in the first weeks of knowing him and had never stopped finding remarkable. The absence of zero-sum thinking, the genuine belief that the land was something they were all on together rather than competing over. "You are a very unusual man," she said, which was what she had said to him in the kitchen of her father's house on a February day 6 years past. "You have mentioned that," he said, with the smile she had fallen in love with. "I will keep mentioning it," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat in the warm kitchen with the October darkness outside and the house quiet around them, the boys long since asleep, and she thought about the foreclosure notice in her apron pocket on a Tuesday in October 6 years and a world ago, and about the 45 days and the nothing she had had, and about everything that had happened since. The land had taken from her for so long. It had taken her father's dream in small pieces, then her mother, then the grasshoppers had taken whole seasons at once, then the drought, then Thomas, then the farm itself, until she had stood in that doorway with nothing left to give. She had understood the land as a force of deprivation, as something that consumed rather than provided, because that had been her experience of it for so long. But it had also given her this. Not given easily, not without cost, not in any way that absolved it of what it had taken. But sitting in this kitchen on this October evening with her husband's hand warm around hers and her sons asleep in their beds upstairs, and the fields outside that had, this season, despite the drought, provided enough, she knew that the equation had changed. Not because the land had changed. The land was exactly what it had always been, because she was no longer alone against it. In the spring of 1891, their daughter was born. They had not talked about wanting a daughter particularly, because they were not people who spoke very much about wanting things they did not have. But when she arrived, dark-haired and small, and with an expression of ancient skepticism that made Dr. Marsh laugh out loud, something in Delia that had not known it was waiting became complete. They named her Clara after no one, just because it was right. James was 6 by then, and William was nearly 4, and Clara arrived into a household that received her with the enthusiasm of children, who had not yet learned to be anything other than fully themselves about their feelings. James studied her with his characteristic thoroughness and declared her interesting. William attempted to pick her up the day after she came home, and had to be firmly redirected. Clara, for her part, observed all of this from whatever surface she was lying on with an expression that suggested she was already forming opinions. The Wells property by 1891 was a serious operation. The cattle herd had grown to over 120 head. The winter wheat program that Phineas had been building carefully for years was now the foundation of the farm's grain production, supplemented by summer crops and the expanded kitchen garden that Delia had turned into something closer to a market garden, selling surplus to the general store in town and occasionally to the hotel. The water system had been extended and improved twice. They had a dairy operation of modest size that Clara would one day decide was her personal domain. They had 3 hired men year-round and additional seasonal labor at harvest, and the bunkhouse that had come with the original Wells property had been expanded to accommodate them properly, with a kitchen and a washroom attached that Delia had insisted upon because she believed that men who worked hard deserved to be housed like human beings and not livestock. Phineas had started a habit in the early 1890s of riding the county boundaries with her every spring, a kind of annual survey of the whole property that was partly practical inspection and partly something else, a private taking of stock. They would leave early in the morning while the boys were still asleep and Clara was with the hired girl, and ride the full perimeter of what was theirs and talk. On the spring survey of 1892, she was sitting on her horse at the northeast corner of the property, the highest ground they had, looking south across the full extent of the fields and corrals and buildings, and she thought about how she used to stand at the edge of her father's land and feel the immensity of it as a burden, the weight of everything that could go wrong. "What are you thinking?" Phineas asked from beside her. He knew her well enough by now to read the particular quality of her silences. She was quiet for a moment. "I am thinking that it does not look the same as it used to. The land, the whole of it. I used to look at this kind of view and count what could be lost. She paused. Now I am counting what is here. He was quiet. The spring wind moved through the grass in long waves that looked, in certain lights, almost like water. That is the difference, I think, he said. That is the whole thing right there. She looked at him. He was 44 now, the gray at his temples more extensive and the lines in his face deeper from years of sun and wind. And he looked more completely himself than he had at 35, the way people do when time settles rather than erodes them. I sold you my farm, she said. You did. And then you hired me. I did. And then I fell in love with you and married you and we built all of this. He looked at her steadily. We did. I keep waiting for the part where it goes wrong, she said. I have been waiting for 8 years. It is a difficult habit to break. He moved his horse alongside hers and reached across and took her hand, the way he had done on that first blizzard night years ago when he had ridden 3 miles through a storm to check on her. Delia, he said. Yes. You are allowed to stop waiting, he said. She held his eyes for a long moment. This man who had given her more than the land had ever taken, who had offered her not salvation but something more honest and durable than that. A partnership, a real one, built on mutual respect and genuine love and the shared labor of a life worth living. I know, she said. And she meant it this time fully, without the reservation that had been in every previous version of that statement. She squeezed his hand and they sat there at the top of their land in the clear spring morning. And below them the wheat fields were greening, and the cattle were moving slowly across the pasture, and from somewhere down near the house, she could hear William's voice raised in some dispute with his brother and Clara's voice, already at the age of 1, contributing a strong and emphatic if semantically unclear opinion. She laughed. It came from somewhere deep in her chest, real and unconstrained, the laugh of someone who had survived a great deal and arrived somewhere worth arriving. We should go back, she said. In a moment, he said. And they sat for one more moment in the spring wind on the high ground of what was theirs, and the sky above the Kansas plain was the particular blue of early morning, and it was theirs as far as they could see. The years that followed moved in the way of good years, with their natural rhythms of effort and rest, difficulty and abundance, the kinds of challenges that a working farm and a growing family produce in steady supply, none of which rose to the level of catastrophe, all of which were met and managed and sometimes exceeded. James, at 15, was already the most thoughtful farmer in the county, with his father's patience and his mother's precise knowledge of the specific land they were working. He had the quality of someone who would do what he did for the right reasons rather than the expedient ones, and Phineas watched him come into himself with a pride he expressed in the dry, understated way of a man who felt things deeply, but performed them quietly. William, at 13, wanted to study law, which surprised everyone and surprised no one, because he had always been the one who wanted to know why the rules were what they were, and what could be done about them when they were wrong. He had heard enough about the land syndicates, and the water rights battles and the railroads, and the treatment of people who did not have the resources to protect themselves that he had developed a focused anger about injustice that needed somewhere useful to go. Phineas wrote a letter to his lawyer in Abilene, asking about educational resources. Delia found books. Clara at 5 decided the dairy operation was hers and organized it accordingly, which had the unexpected effect of significantly improving its productivity. As she applied to the cows the same methodical attention she apparently applied to everything. She would have her mother's green-gray eyes and her father's quiet thoroughness, and she would grow up knowing the land as something she stood on rather than something that stood over her, which was the thing her mother most wanted for her. In the autumn of 1895, Mabel Prout came to supper with them, as she often did, and sat at the kitchen table that had been the center of Delia's life for 12 years now, and looked at the whole room, the fire, the children at their work, Phineas reading at the end of the table, the shelves of preserves and the hanging herbs and the book of poems, green cover worn soft now with years of handling, that lived on the shelf by the window. "You know," Mabel said, "I should be paid a commission on this whole operation." "For what specifically?" Delia asked. "For mentioning his name," Mabel said with a gesture toward Phineas that encompassed the house and the children and the past 12 years and everything else. Phineas looked up from his book. "I am grateful to you for that," he said with complete seriousness. Mabel looked gratified. "See," she said to Delia, "he appreciates me." "You are appreciated," Delia said. "You are appreciated constantly and excessively." "As I should be," Mabel said comfortably. After supper, when Mabel had gone and the children were in bed, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of evening quiet that she loved, Phineas found her standing at the kitchen window looking out at the dark fields. He came and stood beside her, and they looked out together at the nothing visible of the Kansas night, the enormous dark sky scattered with stars. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was not the kind of question he asked often, not because he did not care, but because he was a man who read things rather than asked them, and usually he already knew. The fact that he was asking meant something. She thought about the question with the honesty she always brought to things that mattered. "Yes," she said, "in the particular way of someone who knows what the alternative is, which makes it better than happiness that comes without that knowledge." He nodded slowly. "That is the truest answer to that question I have ever heard." She leaned against him slightly, the way she had learned to in 8 years of standing beside this man, and his arm came around her shoulders in the way it always did, easy and certain. "I was going to lose everything," she said. "I had 45 days and $63, and I thought that was the end of the story." "It was the end of one story," he said. "It was the beginning of this one." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the October wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the fence line. Somewhere in the dark, one of the horses shifted in the corral. The stars were very bright. "The land took from me for 30 years, she said. "It took my parents and my crops and my husband and very nearly the ground under my feet. I thought that was simply what the land did. I thought I had to endure it because there was no other option." "And now," he said. She turned to look at him. This man she had built a life with, who had met her at the exact moment when she had nothing left to give and had offered her not charity but something real, who had loved her with patience and honesty and the kind of steadiness that did not require drama to be felt. "Now I know," she said, "that what I was missing was not the land giving back. I was missing you. The land does what it does. It was you who gave back more than it ever took." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his face was entirely open in the way that was the most private version of him, the one she had been given and intended to keep. He kissed her forehead, then her temple, then the corner of her mouth, with the deliberateness of someone who was not in any hurry and had nothing to prove. "Delia Wells," he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since November of 1883, and I intend to continue doing so without interruption for the foreseeable future." She laughed softly, her face against his chest. "The foreseeable future," she said. "What a modest time frame." "The indefinite future," he amended. "Better," she said. They stood together in the kitchen of the house she had lost and found and made into something entirely new, and outside the Kansas plain stretched away in all directions under the November stars, and the land was exactly what it had always been, hard and beautiful and demanding and indifferent, asking everything of the people who tried to make a life on it. But she was no longer standing against it alone. And in the warm kitchen, with the fire going and the children sleeping upstairs and Phineas's arm around her, the difference between the land taking everything and having someone who gave back more than it took felt, for the first time, like the whole truth of the thing. Not the end of a story about loss, the full ongoing story of something built to last. The winter of 1895 came in slow and cold, and they were ready for it. The wheat was in storage, measured and catalogued in Delia's careful hand on the ledger that lived on the shelf beside the book of poems. The cattle were in the winter pasture with the supplemental feed calculated and organized. The kitchen garden was put to bed under thick straw mulch. The children's winter clothes had been checked and mended, and in William's case, largely replaced, because he had grown 3 inches since last April. The water system that Phineas had built 9 years earlier had been checked and winterized with the thorough attention that had become part of their seasonal routine. She stood on the porch one late November morning and watched the sky to the north where the winter weather came from, and she read it the way her father had taught her to read it when she was 9 years old, looking for the particular density of cloud that meant serious weather, the quality of the light, the behavior of the birds. Clear, for now. But something was building, 2 or 3 days away. She went inside and began the preparations with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been reading this sky for over 30 years and who knew exactly what to do. Behind her, she heard James come down the stairs, his careful step on the wooden treads, and then William with his louder and more direct arrival, and then Clara with the particular small, energetic sound of Clara in motion. She heard Phineas's voice from the kitchen, where he had been since before she was up, already at the table with the ledger and the plans for the winter. She stood in the doorway between the front room and the kitchen and looked at all of them, her family gathered in the morning, the fire going, the coffee on, the day beginning. The land outside was still and cold and enormous. Inside, the world was warm. She stepped forward into it. Outside, very slowly, the first snow of the winter began to fall.